Thank you very much indeed, Emily, for the kind invitation to participate in this webinar this afternoon. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what, particularly what Robbie's got to say. I'd like to start by trying to put the subject of witnessing into some kind of context, really, and particularly where we find ourselves today. Firstly, it's crucial to remember that as human beings, oops, I beg your pardon, as human beings, we are not infallible. I have just lost control of the screen. As human beings, we're not infallible. I did have a short video there just to demonstrate that, but perhaps more importantly, these data from a very large centre in the UK make the point rather better, I think. And you can see here the number of witness points that were measured by the RI witness system in this clinic on a monthly basis over a period of nearly 4 years. And the RI witness system, of course, also automatically records when a mismatch has occurred. And you can see the actual number of mismatches here on a monthly basis. Of course, it only happens perhaps once or twice a month at most, and the RI witness system, of course, prevents the mistake going any further and stops anything dreadful happening. But what's interesting is that it does happen on an ongoing basis, and the instance here equates roughly to some perhaps 1 in every 5,000 times that an embryologist does something, then they get it wrong. And others have reported similar sorts of incidents of mismatches in their own clinics. In 2002, this whole problem was brought into very sharp focus when a white couple gave birth to black twins at a centre in the north of England. And I'm sure many of you in the audience will remember what a dreadful time that was, particularly to be an embryologist. But mistakes continue to be made in labs around the world, and as you can see here, every year, every few months, in fact, something goes quite badly wrong in IVF units. And even less than a year ago now, this couple in the States gave birth to twins that were neither related to the parents nor indeed were the twins related to each other. So these dreadful events are still happening. Back in 2002, and in response to the black twins incident, the HFEA issued a requirement that, in simple terms, all points at which a mix-up could occur within an assisted reproductive technology procedure be witnessed. And this was incorporated, first of all, into the 6th edition of their code of practice, which was published in 2004. And that, in essence, required manual witnessing. It used phrases like "in the presence of at least 2 members of staff" or "witnessed by an appropriate person." So back in those days, they were talking about manual witnessing. Around about the same time, the electronic witnessing systems were being developed, and the HFEA formed an advisory group on safety and new technologies. And I was fortunate enough to be part of that group, and you can see on the slide here the remit, the sorts of things that we were asked to consider and reach conclusions on. And the HFEA advisory group considered that electronic witnessing was at least as good, if not better, than manual witnessing. And that is, of course, now enshrined in the HFEA's code of practice. This is the latest 9th edition here, and we're all very familiar that there is an entire chapter on witnessing and assuring patient and donor ID. And again, as this audience will be very familiar with, these are the procedures that the HFE would require that should be witnessed in some way, shape or form, and we're all very familiar with those, although perhaps not many of us undertake transferring nuclear material for mitochondrial donation. But we now face a new challenge, and I'd like to just mention a couple of points in relation to the IVF lab and to witnessing. Firstly, the lab itself, in my view, is pretty safe. We almost invariably have HEPA filtration, so the air that comes into our labs is going to be extremely clean and likely free of virus. And there is, as far as the evidence suggests at this point in time, minimal risk from the gametes, embryos and blood, etc., that we might encounter in the lab. So the problem is the people. The problem is caused by the humans that are in or near the lab, and as such we need to find ways to, I think, reduce as far as possible face-to-face interaction between patients and staff and the staff themselves. And indeed there may be ways to work in isolation, or changing shift patterns, working in smaller teams, etc., which I'm sure Rob is going to talk about in much more detail. Some of the other problems that present themselves are the requirements to use masks, which makes communication less effective perhaps in a noisy lab. And although we should be wearing gloves for most of the lab procedures, it's still going to be prudent to touch equipment as little as possible. And of course, the equipment that we use will need to be easily decontaminated as well. But I think what is also key here, what we mustn't lose sight of, and it's perhaps quite easy to lose sight of it because COVID is at the forefront of everybody's mind, but what we mustn't lose sight of within embryology is that we mustn't compromise safety by introducing any new procedures and new ways of doing things. So just coming to an end now, this photograph of an embryologist manually witnessing a procedure pretty much sums up what is now much more difficult to achieve. So they are necessarily very close to each other, they're not wearing gloves, they're not wearing masks, they're holding paper, and which lives in a plastic wallet, which invariably lots of other people will have touched throughout the treatment cycle. So that's what we can't do anymore now, and this is the challenge, I guess. In the UK, ARCS and the British Fertility Society, supported by the HFEA, have issued best practice guidelines for routine fertility treatment during the pandemic, and others, of course, have done similar around the world in Europe and America, etc. And in simple terms, this guidance asks us to consider that when we're using equipment, this equipment might allow for greater distancing, automation, and facilitate more flexible workflow within the department. And the use of electronic witnessing systems is specifically cited in this guidance. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and hand over now to Robbie. Thank you.
So thanks very much, firstly, to Cooper Surgical for inviting me and giving the opportunity to talk to you all today about certainly our experiences here in Belfast with the use of RI Witness, and maybe a bit about thinking outside the box slightly in terms of how we're going to use Witness moving forward in light of the current situation we find ourselves in relation to COVID-19. So, as you know, I'm sure everybody attending the webinar today is used to seeing this little graph that we see from the UK government on their daily briefings, telling us where we are in terms of our stage in the pandemic. Now, back at the peak where we were seeing significant numbers of deaths and hospital admissions each day, we were sitting around about 5 at the commencement of lockdown. But, you know, we now find ourselves, as of last week, we're sort of graded as being in level 3, which means the virus is classified as being in general circulation, and we should start to see a gradual relaxation of the restrictions. So in terms of that, what we have is we see that it doesn't mean that the pandemic is over, not by a long shot. What this basically means is it's still in general circulation, and we're likely to see localized general outbreaks occur, you know, across the UK over the coming months. And certainly, I believe this week, you know, they've highlighted that there's been an outbreak in Leicester in particular. So there's going to have to be local responses as these outbreaks occur. But we are going to see this gradual relaxation of restrictions. But all industries must remain alert to minimise the potential impact of this second wave as we return to work, which hopefully avoids another prolonged lockdown again. But I think the take-home message from this first slide is that it's not going to be business as usual for us in the IVF lab for a very long time. Okay, so as we said, you know, back in the peak of the outbreak, we were seeing, you know, over 1,000 deaths a day were occurring. But as the graph here on the left shows, you know, we're now getting down close, hopefully into the sort of single figures realm, ideally. So the first wave is officially classified as being in decline. In response to that, back in May, on the 11th of May, the HFEA stated that licensed clinics were allowed to apply to reopen from that point. As of the 19th of June, 96 clinics across the whole of the UK have actually now been granted permission to reopen. So the sector is starting to get back into business. And from our own perspective in Belfast, you know, we started carrying out our first egg collections this week, which was nice to see again after a prolonged period of inactivity. But the fundamental thing that's underpinning us reopen is that the safety of patients and clinic staff is an absolute priority. And certainly what the HFEA had said was that before a clinic could resume treatment, they had to be able to demonstrate they could provide a safe service for patients and a safe working environment for the clinic staff that was completely in line with the professional guidance that Steve alluded to in his introductory slides. So the other thing was that clinics should have a clear COVID-19 treatment commencement strategy in place before they were allowed to restart treatment, and that not all clinics were going to be able to start up at the exact same time. So, in terms of the guidance that came out in advance of the HFEA allowing us to reapply, that was underpinned by 5 key principles in the ARC's BFS COVID guidelines for us reopening. Firstly, the resumption of fertility services needed to take place in a manner that would minimise the chances of the spread of COVID-19 and infection to patients and staff. And that meant introducing the likes of social distancing. Can we minimise numbers of patients that are going to be in the clinic at any one time, and tweaking our procedures to help accommodate that. Centres were to be sure that they had a fair and transparent approach to any prioritisation policy. You know, for example, in our own mind, we've taken the approach that we're dealing with all patients whose treatment were cancelled due to COVID-19 initially before we start any new stimulation cycles. So we're just working through that backlog of patients that were in the system over the next 4 weeks initially. The resumption of treatment should not result in an undue burden on the NHS, i.e. we shouldn't reopen our clinics business as usual, start putting in lots of OHSS admissions with torsion of the ovary and other unavoidable complications from fertility treatment to the NHS when it could be potentially under strain. Also, that any patients considering treatment during the current restrictions should be fully informed about the potential and impacts of the pandemic on their ongoing treatment, and them giving consent in the likelihood that the clinics have to shut down again in the event of a second wave. Okay, but the other thing that underpinned it was that the fertility sector should adopt sustainable changes to our working practices, which would help build resilience against any future increases in the spread of COVID-19 in the community. And that creates significant challenges for us moving forward. So, as you can see here, I think point number 1 and point number 5 are the absolute critical ones in terms of what we are going to be talking about today. You know, about minimising risks to staff and patients and changing how we work in the laboratory. So, the following recommendations were made in the ARCS BFS guidelines, and that was to ensure that we could introduce physical distancing wherever possible in the lab. So they talked about reconfiguration of your clinic. You know, now, I appreciate in laboratories, it's very difficult to just pick up and move your ICSI rigs to another place in the lab, but certainly in sort of general areas like offices, etc., could we separate staff out, move the areas where staff work, and zone our clinics off better to implement social distancing? We had restricting the use of communal areas, encouraging staff to work from home wherever that was possible. Certainly most of our medical staff are now doing their consultations from home to avoid the need via Zoom and Teams to avoid the need to bring patients and doctors into the clinic unnecessarily. Production of semen samples, potentially where possible, could be done at home, and trying to introduce virtual meetings wherever possible for consultation, planning appointments, counselling, etc. Switching to using electronic platforms to take patient consent, and using approved electronic communications and messaging systems wherever possible. Whereas also looking at restricting the amount of times you need to bring both parties in from a couple for treatment if you don't actually really need both of them there. And that all ties in with limiting the numbers of patients and staff you're going to have in each area of the clinic at any one time. And where possible, centres were to consider using equipment that would allow for greater physical distancing, automation, and facilitate a more flexible workflow. So once again, I've highlighted here, I think, the critical points about embracing electronic technology to help us manage our way through this crisis. So, now I'm sure quite a few of you have seen a slide like this before. Now, this would be what I like to call, looks like a cell signalling diagram from my PhD days. So what we have here is, you know, very complex RI witness sort of diagram describing. But one thing I often ask is, when was the last time you as an embryologist took a look at your witness map? You know, have you actually reviewed that since you set it up? I know certainly we set ours back up in 2013, and we maybe only ever look at it when we change a procedure, which means we have to tweak something in the map. It's not something we would ever have done a radical overhaul on, you know. So I would ask you to look at these again and sort of say, can you refine this? You know, are there steps in that map that are completely unnecessary in light of the current situation we find ourselves in? You know, have you got additional double witness steps, or as we call them in our lab, we call it a triple witness step, which is where you would have your operator, your embryologist who's carrying out the procedure, you would have RI witness as the secondary witness, and then you have the third person who is the additional manual witness that would come in, for example, at the time of egg collection, which we classify as an entry point in our system. We call that triple locked witness. Do you have additional steps done like that that you don't actually require in your witness map that could be removed at the moment? So basically, due to COVID-19, is now the right time to look at this process again. Now, the next slides are really just for the benefit of anyone who's not a current RI witness user, which is just to give you a general overview of how the system works. So when a couple comes to the clinic, they're assigned basically a unique ID card, which is tagged with their own ID and tagged with their details. And this then can be used throughout the entire process to allow us to track corresponding dishes, tubes and vessels used in the process that have the same matching details. If at any point we move a tag from patient A into the reader and we have a dish there from, say, patient B, the system immediately locks down and won't allow us to proceed to the next step until we've brought someone in to verify what has actually happened at that point in the process. So it's a very robust way of minimizing the impact of these mismatches in your lab. So, and then that proceeds through, you know, whereas at each step in the process, for example, insemination steps through to loading your embryos into your embryo transfer dish, every step in the entire process is tracked. The way I often describe it to our patients in the clinic is it's kind of like your embryos have a passport as they move through the entire process, which allows us to track every single time your dish was removed from the incubator and every single interaction that was carried out on your embryos through that whole process. And this carries all the way through to this, what we classify as the exit points at the end of the system, which would be embryo transfer, cryopreservation, or embryo biopsy in the case of clinics carrying out PGTA, etc. So in terms of witnessing the COVID area, Steve sort of touched on, you know, the HFEA stance in witnessing, touching on the initial witnessing guidance in the 6th edition of the Code of Practice, the introduction of electronic witnessing in the 7th edition, and then that carried through to what we find in the current 9th edition. And those witnessing steps are now, as Steve mentioned, fully enshrined into our practices. So what is the HFEA's actual stance on the use of witnessing and electronic witnessing in the current Code of Practice? Now, I'm not going to regurgitate the whole Code of Practice for you because we could be here all night. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of the key points that I think are relevant, okay? So as we said, in the 7th edition, they updated the guidance to reflect the introduction of new technology in the form of electronic witnessing systems such as RI-Witness and the Matcher system. Now, the general guidance from the HFEA around witnessing has changed and evolved in the current 9th edition of the Code of Practice. But if you go to the specific section on electronic witnessing, this hasn't really changed for over 10 years now. Essentially, you know, the guidance specifically relating to the electronic systems has remained fairly constant, although the general guidance has changed. Now, this raises a question. Electronic witnessing is no longer new technology. You know, we've had this technology for over 10 years, been fully validated in numerous centres. You can find lots of publications out there on the literature, you know, highlighting lots of poster presentations have been done through the meetings over the years, showing that it is as robust, if not actually more so than a manual witnessing system. So in light of COVID-19, I think now is the right time for us to potentially, in conjunction with the HFEA, have a look at this guidance again and see, does it really reflect the situation that we find ourselves in now? So in terms of the current Code of Practice, you know, the licence conditions state that centres must have a robust system in place and effective processes to ensure that no mismatches of gametes, embryos or identification errors occur. And centres must double check the identification of samples and the patients and donors to whom they relate to at all critical points in laboratory processes, okay? And these must be recorded in the notes and the records at the time that they've taken place. And Steve gave a pretty comprehensive list of what those steps are, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Okay. Guidance Note 18.1 states that witnessing protocols should ensure that every sample of gametes or embryos can be identified at every single stage in the process to prevent any mismatches of gametes or embryos. And 18.2 states that centres are responsible for ensuring that the witnessing protocols are relevant to the local systems and FEA model protocols, which were released back in 2006, I think, on the 5th edition of the Code of Practice. So, you know, there's there's quite a few things have changed since then. Okay, and the last one, 18.3, is that electronic systems such as barcoding and RFIDs for assisted conception are appropriate but should be subject to a risk assessment prior to implementation. Okay, so dealing on specifically with what they say around the use of electronic witnessing. So 18.38 stipulates that where centres are using an electronic witnessing system, such as one with forcing functions. Now what we mean by forcing functions is, for example, in my witness map, we cannot progress to the next step. So if I haven't done the insemination step on a set of eggs, it will not allow me to then proceed on to carry out the next steps in that patient's pathway. So the HFA deemed that those were steps that didn't require, you know, a double witness, for example, like doing an embryo check on day 2 when the embryos are in that dish, or a day 3 check. There's no need for you to actually have a double witness at that step. Okay. So they did stipulate, though, that that exemption should not apply to the mixing of sperm and eggs, or injecting sperm into eggs and placing gametes or embryos into or removing them from cryopreservation. Okay. Then it stated that centres should not rely solely on electronic witnessing systems either to check the identity of patients and donor samples, and centres should follow protocols for witnessing in line with their HFA model protocols. Now, once again, interestingly though, prior to this, there is a statement which we have used certainly in Belfast in terms of how we wrote our own policies on witnessing. So centres should conduct a formal risk assessment before introducing or changing witnessing protocols, or interestingly, departing from the HFA guidance on this. And I think it's this statement here which is critical, which basically says much of this is guidance, but, you know, and you can deviate from it, but you need to be pretty confident that you can justify why you've done that and that you've made that change for a good reason. You have risk assessed that change and you've put the additional barriers and safeguards in place to make sure that your deviation from that guidance is not going to bring about any errors. Okay, so as I said, these two critical points are very, very crucial in terms of how we approach this subject. But Guidance Note 18.28 potentially provides an avenue to potentially challenge the two previous points. So, in terms of the Belfast experience, just to give you a bit of background on how we set up our witnessing system here. So we opened in late 2013, but prior to this, I had significant experience using witnessing to other clinics that I had worked in the past. And, you know, I would often ask the question, actually, what is the difference between electronic witnessing and a centre using only manual witnessing? And this became more relevant to myself when I left the clinics I worked in Manchester and went to Glasgow Royal Infirmary, which at that time was still 100% manual witnessing. And what became evident was that how much more robust our electronic witnessing systems had actually been in the Manchester clinics. And thinking, well, actually, you know, the electronic systems are significantly safer when you actually compare them side by side in terms of their potential to pick up and provide that level of traceability in every step in the process. So we looked then at our new lab we're setting up in Belfast and asked the question, what are the actual risks through the entire process of where mix-ups can happen, where the problems are going to lie, but can we remove some of these additional manual witnessing steps that traditionally maybe we've always done when the technology was new and we didn't have such faith in it, by introducing some earlier checks at different points in the process. And that was the sort of context to it. What we felt this would help us facilitate is when the clinic opened, we only had 2 embryologists. So this was going to help facilitate potentially have a single embryologist working over weekends, for example, and during public holidays. Okay, so in 2013, the HFA granted our license, but at that time, interestingly, we were not triple witnessing, as I would call it, the insemination steps in our witness pathway from the day the clinic opened. We introduced a system of electronic witnessing only for that step at that point. Okay, we're successfully relicensed by the HFEA using the same techniques and processes in light of all the audit data we were able to provide on that in 2019. So, next slide is just to give you a bit of an overview of our pathway. So, how the system works effectively is we have 2 triple witness points at the very start in our pathway. Now, in my viewpoint, the most critical point is the assigning of that ID card at the outset. If that is wrong from the outset, the whole thing has the potential to be wrong. So that is a triple lot witness point. And at that point, we are pairing up the female partner, all her details, the male partner, if applicable, or female partner in same-sex couples. You know, we are matching all of that up and ensuring that's fully accurate. Triple lot witness with a third person observing that, as well as the RI witness system. We then have the same triple witness step happens at our 2, what we call entry points into the system. During the egg collection, you would have, now these ones are quite easy to maintain social distancing in effect, because the way we would be set up in our Belfast lab is that the egg collection witness is actually the scrub nurse in theatre who comes to the hatch at the time, and we have a video screen linked into the camera on our microscope, which means she never has to lean inside the hood as per Steve's image that he showed in his slides, and is actually able to do that exclusively off the screen above the cabinet, you know, and witness the eggs, that we are placing them into the correct dish for the patient's ID card that is placed in the reader in theatre. Okay, from the sperm prep, once again, that's done in a similar way. We have a larger screen that basically the embryologists are able to read from the outside of the hood, and they can just use their tag to fob against the reader, basically to witness that the sperm prep belongs to that male. We then have some additional points at that point, because what we try to get away from is minimising the number of unassigned tags that we have in our system. So our sperm prep witness involves you witness the sperm pot, triple witness, and the labelling of every single tube is labelled and assigned in the RI witness system at that point as well, which basically means when you get to the end of that sperm prep, you have that tube. You don't have someone witness a pot in and then transfer that between a lot of unassigned tags in our pathway. So you come to the end of that process, all of the eggs dishes and the sperm tubes are both assigned to that couple. So from that point on, you actually cannot have a mismatch in effect, because if you take the wrong patient's sperm tube and wrong patient's eggs dish, you're going to get a mismatch on the RI witness system from that point onwards. So actually, there really is no point to this triple witness here at insemination unless the witness system has gone down. And obviously, as you're required to do, we have contingency plans in place for where the witnessing system would fail in the clinic. So all the way through the rest of our entire pathway is electronic witnessing only from this point, because you've no unassigned tags at this point. You know, everything is assigned prior to that insemination, other than transferring into your embryoscope dish, which would be, but in line with the current HFEA guidance, there's no require for that to be a triple locked witness step. Then we finally have our exit point, which in our clinic is transfer or vitrification. And once again, at the moment, we do triple witness this step once again, which is the freezing of the embryos and making sure they're frozen into the correct devices that match up with that patient, because we don't currently use the RI witness barcoding system in our clinic. It's something I'm thinking seriously about introducing now. Once again, because I actually think we can use that technology to remove the need for that additional triple witness step at the end of the process. So, in terms of some of our audit data from Belfast, so pre our last HFEA inspection, we pulled off all of the data since the clinic had opened. What we saw is that we had over 55,000 witness procedures had been carried out. and only 170 mismatches in that time, which is an average of 0.3%, which is tiny, but they are not zero. And actually, I wouldn't expect them to be zero, because ultimately there are going to be, we are human beings, and there are going to be times when something happens, you're distracted, but the system is there to give us that peace of mind that it's going to pick up on it. And that's where I think this data is really true. So if we look, we only observed actually 28 true mismatches in that time, which actually is a 0.05%. Now, in terms of what the mismatches were, when I talk about true mismatches, these are the ones we would call, yes, it's a mismatch, but they're pretty soft ones, i.e. patient was taken out of theatre and the ID card was left inside the reader. A very common one. Embryologist then comes to the microscope to carry out a procedure and puts the dish down without realising that card is still sat in the reader in theatre. Most common one as well would be during our setup procedures, people sit in multiple sets of charts and notes for the patient with ID cards in them far too close to the readers in the hoods, which once again picks up all of those ID cards, get a mismatch. The other one is training dishes, which we've kept for training our junior embryologists. Often at the end of the process, they may forget they are from two different patients and bring them both out to the hood at the same time when they're doing training. So we've had a few mismatches there, and a couple related to IT issues and system delays where we've had to stop the witness system and just revert to manual witnessing because there's been lags or delays in the system. Fortunately, those are very, very rare though. Okay, so in terms of the true mismatches, since 2013, only 2 of those mismatches have actually occurred at the process of insemination. And both of those have been a case where the sperm sample from a previous patient was left still sitting in the rack in the hood when the next sperm sample has been brought in by a different embryologist carrying out the second insemination of the day. But in both cases, the eggs dish had never been removed from the incubator, which once again, I think illustrates how well the system actually works, because it prevented the case proceeding without us saying, oh, what's causing this mismatch? You know, with manual witnessing, can you be sure, you know, I'm sure a lot of you work in strange yellow light or have low level lighting in your laboratories. If someone had left a small tube in a rack sitting with no RI readers there at all, can you be 100% sure that your embryologist would have noticed that tube there, or would they just have been looking at the tube that the embryologist about to perform an insemination is holding in their hands? That embryologist potentially gets distracted during that procedure and then picks up the second tube that's accidentally been left in the hood. You know, with the electronic witnessing systems, these things can't happen because the system picks up on it. So I often ask the question, actually, why do we have these additional requirements on electronic witnessing when it clearly seems to actually work better than manual witnessing? So the question I want to ask today in the talk is, can we take this then, based on this slight tweaking of the traditional witnessing guidance we've done in Belfast, and actually take this on to the next stage and remove the need for all manual witness steps other than ID card assign potentially? Okay, so one thing which I'm sure you're all used to using if you're an RI witness user is the principle of an unassigned tag, which basically means you have your eggs in one dish, you're going to move them to an unassigned dish, and you are going to make that dish the unique property of that patient when you move those over. And that's very common, works well. We use a number of them in our current processes at the moment. But they do potentially create an issue if you were to move to 100% electronic witnessing system for a couple of reasons, I think. You know, you could have what I would call an unrecorded mismatch. So, you know, if you are using unassigned tags, you can potentially take out a dish which has printed labels for patient B, although the dish you have already on the hood belongs to patient A. Now, you pick up on that as the operator and say that's wrong. So you then take that unassigned dish, put it back in the incubator and get the correct dish out. but that's never recorded anywhere that that potential mismatch took place, okay? So there is a potential there with using unassigned tags that you could accidentally assign a dish that to patient A when all of the printed labels are already on that dish for patient B. Then you have a change of shift pattern, COVID-19 splitting into two teams. What does the embryologist do who comes in later on that day and takes out patient A's dish for transfer, says it belongs to her on the witness system, but actually all the printed labels have someone else's details on them? So, you know, there is an inherent risk there if you were to move to 100% electronic witnessing system, you know, and not have that additional person checking that step for you. So one of the things we've been experimenting with here in Belfast during lockdown is, can we move to a system of pre-assigning all of our tags at the very start of the process, so that everything belongs to that patient from the very outset, and all of that pre-assigning of those tags is triple witnessed at the very start, which would then facilitate a system where you could run through the entire cycle without the need to bring in that second manual witness at any point in the process, because the witness system will pick up on any issues. So, as I said, most of these tags can be assigned. So we've mapped out this scenario whereby at the outset of the cycle, which would be the day of setup, you would set up all of your egg collection dishes. You will set up your tubes that are going to be used in the sperm prep, the sperm pot. All of that then is assigned at that point in time. You then would have your egg collection. Obviously, you would have no need, because the way we work is, instead of giving the patients the ID cards themselves, the lab keep hold of the ID card until we actually go to see the patient just prior to egg collection. And we have a sign-over procedure where we hand the card over, the correct card, to that patient. That is then triple witnessed by the doctor who's going to carry out the procedure. The patient keeps a hold of that card, and then that is taken off the patient when they arrive in theatre. That way, when that goes into the reader, we can only remove the pre-assigned egg collection dishes for that patient. So there's actually no need for that additional triple witness at that step. Same process with the sperm prep. The sperm pot has been pre-assigned to that patient. When we give the sperm pot to that patient to put him in the room to produce his sample, that can be a triple witness step where the patient themselves sign the triple witness that we have given them the correct sperm pot that has their full details for both them and their partner. Once again, that can come back into the lab and now can only be used with the pre-assigned sperm prep tubes that match that pot. If we take another patient's tubes, we'll get a mismatch on the system. And that follows all the way through the entire process, because all of those tags and dishes move into using, we use 100% time lapse in the clinic as well, and single step culture media. So straight after the ICSI is done, you know, the EmbryoScope dish is set up the day before the egg collection. So the eggs then move into that EmbryoScope dish that's all pre-assigned on that day. Once again, no need for triple witnessing at this step, all the way through to the exit point. And actually, I think this system could potentially work and solve a lot of these challenges around how we socially distance in the lab in light of COVID-19. So, other things we've been experimenting with down there is the use of platforms such as Zoom and Teams. If clinics are not comfortable going as crazy as the last slide and removing all the manual witnessing, you know, you can experiment with other things. We found that by using the screen share options on Microsoft Teams, we've been able to share steps that we've trialed out just using tags that we've assigned to patients in the lab, with me sat up in my office here with a very grumpy face, concentrating on the witness system, you know, basically doing the ID check almost completely outside of the lab. So that solves our social distancing issue once again. So I think the message here is I think now is the time that there's an opportunity for us to really embrace and maximise the technology that we have at our fingertips at the moment. And certainly COVID-19 has made us more aware of what that technology can do for us and how it can work. I.e., I don't need to sit in as many meetings actually inside my work anymore. I can dial into them from home. So once again, just to re-emphasise that, you know, potential with this system, this model, would be you would only have 2 triple witness points at the very start in the entire system. It would help you maintain your 2-metre social distancing, allow you to easier segregate your lab staff into 2 teams to protect them, and it would facilitate bringing in fewer embryologists over the weekend. However, detailed risk assessment is going to be critical to anything that you do here to keep yourself in line with those HFEA regulations. Now, I highlighted these 2 points earlier about where you're making any change, you have to look at the impact, the barriers, safeguards, and the risks involved in making that change. So in our clinic, we use the following model to basically carry out our risk assessments. And it's basically what we call a risk wheel. It's really simplistic. So we identify those risks. So in the process of looking at our witnessing, we're looking at every single step where we could potentially introduce error and risk. We then analyse those, and we created a planned risk response for the HFEA when we initially set up in 2013. And we've mapped out a sort of similar idea to my proposal that I have there around a move to complete electronic witnessing. You know, so we have a planned response of each and every step in the process, how that works, how the risks are going to be mitigated, and then we've a clear plan in terms of how we are going to monitor that. Now, in terms of introducing this model with witnessing, we would look to phase that in. If we were to go adopt that second option that I've presented to you, we would probably do that over a phased period where we would have a limited number of cycles where we would say, right, we are going to pilot witness map B for this group of patients, collect the data, highlight how that works. But during that initial phase in, we would also look and have additional sort of security steps written in just to check that the system works in practice, because you can design a witness map, but it's only until you actually start using it in practice you identify, there's a potential loop here that we need to close out. So there's a slow and methodical process to how we do that. We then identify any potential risks on that, and then you follow the circle through again until you close off all of those loopholes, and that's your risk assessment complete. And then that can then be presented, you know, to the HFEA in terms of saying, is this something which, in light of COVID-19, that your inspectors would be comfortable with? And certainly that was the approach we took back in 2013 when we removed a lot of the traditional double witnessing steps that you would have used in the past, was taking this approach to it. So it certainly would be something, you know, I'd be happy to, you know, give a bit more information to anybody in the webinar, you know, after today in terms of how we carried out that process. So I'm just going to wrap things up here with the last slide. So in conclusion, you know, COVID-19 and the continued restrictions present a significant challenge to us in the IVF lab. We've got great technology in our labs at the moment, which can actually be a huge asset in helping us solve some of these problems. And I would ask any embryologist and lab manager, now is the time to look again at your witnessing processes. Use COVID-19 as an opportunity to question and say, actually, can we do things differently in light of this? You know, but I do think we maybe need a coordinated response across the sector to maybe look again at the guidance in electronic witnessing with the HFA and sort of say, does it really reflect actually where these systems are now, over 10 years since they were initially introduced? You know, and as I said, I think that we really need to embrace this change as we're going to come out of this with a completely different outlook on how we work. And I'm just going to finish with a little quote from Bill Clinton, which I think is particularly pertinent, which says the price of doing the same old thing is far higher than the price of change. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Robbie. I'm having a smile at your quote there. So thank you very much. It was I thought it was really good to hear how you and Belfast Fertility have adapted to the new ways of working in these times of COVID-19. So that was a really interesting and thought-provoking talk there, Robbie. I'm sure it's given our users of the system a lot of questions. So please put those questions into the chat function. We've had some come through already. All you need to do is just type them in if you've got them, and we'll work through those questions now. So first question coming up. And some of these questions, I've said, they're quite intricate. People are clearly thinking this through, clearly thinking about how they're going to adapt their system and how they're going to work this in their clinics. So if you are sending patients home with their sample pots, are you putting the RFID tag on the pot and allocating it before he goes home, or only on receipt of the pot? And would this be different? Would this be a different protocol to a sample produced in the clinic? So Robbie, perhaps you can answer that one first.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we've been debating that in the last sort of week downstairs. So at the moment, we are assigning the RFID tag on to, because we haven't moved over to that revised system I've proposed. At the moment, we are, when the pot comes in, there's no RFID. The reason for that being, we worry it could maybe be damaged in some way, you know, while it's outside of the clinic, particularly where the patients would be producing off-site. So when the patient comes in, we then basically have a step there where that then is assigned over to that patient by 2 embryologists at that point in time. With the new system, for any patient probably producing off-site, we will need to do the same at that point to make sure, because those entry points, as I highlighted, that is the critical point in the process if you're pre-assigning tags. If those entry points are wrong, the whole house of cards falls down.
Yeah, thank you for that. Steve, in your experience of using the system, what did you do?
Well, we didn't give out pre-tagged pots to patients to produce samples at home. They entered the system when they came in, when they came into the centres. But just thinking about it, I don't suppose it really matters whether the tag is attached to the pot before or after the chap takes the thing home. It is, you know, it's to do with the fact that the point at which it is attached, there is surety that that sample belongs to him as much as you possibly can. So I think either would work, to be perfectly honest.
That's great. Sally and Nathan, I come to you as application specialists. Would you advise one way over the other, or like Steve, would you say either way would work?
I think it's possible. I mean, it would, from a technical point of view, it would be fine to stick one to the bottom of your sperm pot and allocate it, give it to the man, and then do a double check when he comes back in. The only thing that, if I'm thinking from I'm trying to think of ways to break the system. And if I was a patient who was coming in, perhaps with a friend or a brother or something, and if I had a pre-allocated pot, then there was, you know, I'm trying to think through if there's any way I could kind of peel that label off and put it on another pot. But then there's also visual labels as well. And I know this sounds crazy, but actually we are having these conversations with some clinics in some areas of the world, not the UK, but in other areas of the world where, particularly for men, you know, the idea of infertility is very anathema, and their brothers and their friends will help them out. So we are actually seeing this kind of deliberate sabotage, if you like, or a deliberate trying to cheat of the system coming in, and we're trying to put ways in which to prevent that. For example, we're bringing in fingerprint scanning. Some clinics want to be fingerprint scanning to provide that kind of extra level of security. Didn't really answer your question. I don't know. I think it would be fine either way, but yeah, different things to think about.
Yeah, and an interesting comment there about the development of the system, Sally, with the fingerprinting. Next question. Do you think you'll get a lot of wastage with pre-assigning? Robbie, what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, wastage is unavoidable in the IVF laboratory, as we all know. You know, at the end of any given month, there's always bottles of media get thrown away. But I think, you know, we find that generally, you know, the way our guys are scanning, you know, on the majority of cases, you can pretty much predict the number of dishes that you're going to require. If anything, we're more prone to actually needing to assign additional tags, if anything. For example, the patient who then needs a second EmbryoScope dish, which we didn't anticipate for, that we have to set up. So what we need to build into that revised pathway is how we deal with where we have to introduce additional assigned tags into the system, you know, that you haven't planned for. And that's the thing I'm now looking at with that model is how that could potentially work.
Oh, thank you for that. Austin, Sally, Nathan, on that note, what would you recommend for Robbie to implement that part of it?
I can answer that. So there is a function in the system. If you like, it's a manual override into the system, and we call it an admin assign. I'm sure Robbie uses it.
Yeah.
Now, an admin assign is an anomaly with your standard protocols. Obviously, a mismatch is an anomaly, but also an admin assign means something's happened outside of the norm. If you have lots of these because you're having to regularly make a new embryo culture dish or time-lapse dish, then it's going to be a bit of a pain, because not only does it bring up a screen where you have to enter the details and it's all recorded and things, you also, in some circumstances, depending on the member of staff it is, you need to get a senior member of staff to come and help you do that admin assign. So what we would do in that case is we would have multiple pathways of how we could jump into the middle of, you know, that witness point diagram, jump into the middle of it if we needed to have a new embryo culture dish, for example. It would be possible to do. You just want to have that double, or in this case triple witnessing on that. It would be a new entry point, if you like.
Individual dish, yeah.
Great, thank you for that. I've got a follow-up question on that in the chat box. Comment is, nice talk, Robbie. So agree with pre-allocation of tags. What do you do about tag failures on the inseminate tubes or culture slides prior to embryo transfers?
So this is something I looked at just back last year. I mean, we had been very lucky. We haven't had a huge amount of tag failures. We just got a little batch of them occurred back, I think it was 2018. And on those cases where because we had the preceding step in the process was fine, we've never had it happen at insemination in the lab. I think it was at an embryo transfer that happened with us. You know, we came to get the EmbryoScope dish from the EmbryoScope, tag not reading anymore, tag failure. And at that point in time, that's where your manual witnessing steps have to kick in. So, you know, we're then from that point on, our embryo transfer dish wasn't reading either. And at that point, that's where we just completely revert to manual witnessing. Now, we never have a situation in the clinic where an embryologist is 100% lone working. There is always someone around who would be designated as an appropriate person to witness. If you don't happen to have another embryologist, you're going to have to bring in one of the theatre team to come in and do that witnessing for you. So that's sort of how we deal with tag failures. But in my experience, they're pretty rare unless someone's been trying to save tags off a dish that wasn't used, which I've just always said, if it's stuck on a dish, don't try and peel it off. It's a no-no, because that's where the tag failures tend to come from, in my experience.
Yeah, sensible advice. I can see a lot of nodding there going on and people agreeing with you on that one. Another question here. What is the suggested protocol if you have the case where the visible label differs from the RFID information? So perhaps we come to Austin, Sally and Nathan with that one first.
I think at that point there, you would have to trust the electronic witnessing system, that was done correctly at the start, and that we had this question before where somebody was labeling the lid and perhaps the lid was changed with another lid and it didn't match the tag. The tag is correct. You have to trust the tag, and the labeling is incorrect at that stage.
Robbie, what do you
Emily,
do?
if I could just go in there, I think that's an interesting point, because that really, I think that's an issue which is more likely to occur with the use of unassigned tags, whereas switching to the pre-assigned tags will pretty much remove that as a problem, because all of that labeling and the tagging has been double witnessed at that setup point. You know, that issue in my experience has happened once in our lab, and it is a case that you have to trust the electronic witnessing, because you know that it was the electronic witnessing dish was the source of the eggs that ended up in the dish with the wrong patient name on the lid, very similar to the situation Austin described. But it certainly is one of the reasons I think moving to the pre-assigned tags would get away from that.
Great, thank you. Steve, have you got any comments on that one?
Other than to say that I agree with Robbie, I think that the pre-assigning tags would effectively pretty much remove that. But you know, if this situation does occur, it is extremely serious, because you are left wondering what on earth's going on. And in a sense, you would treat each case differently. I think you'd be looking back to see what other information you could gather about, you know, to determine who the dish belonged to, because there may be witness points or manual witness points earlier in the process that you could refer back to. So it's a serious problem when it happens, but would need to be managed individually. But pre-assigning the tags would more or less get rid of that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that. Another question that's come in. Robbie, how do you assign different types of dishes at the same time?
So with my experimental model on this at the moment, if I stick a set of tags onto the reader, I basically just have that set. I can assign those tags as any dish in my entire process. So you have basically the option of, it could be an egg collection dish, it could be a sperm prep tube, it could be anything. So it's at that time of setup. So we've labelled up, say, 3 egg collection dishes for that patient. We put all 3 of those dishes onto the reader, and then those could all be assigned to that patient at that time. The 2 stripping dishes that we've set up for that patient, they go on next, and then we assign those stripping dishes on the day prior to egg collection. Now, it does mean that that setup process is slightly more laborious than you would be used to now, but I think you see the benefit of the rest of the process being far more streamlined further down the line. Now, I'm quite sure there's probably a small number of clinics out there who are also experimenting, or may already be pre-assigning, may actually have more refined ways of doing this, and I would be interested to speak to them, because, as I say, this is something we haven't fully implemented yet, but it's something I would like to do, certainly as a sort of pilot type study in Belfast.
Interesting question. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that one? Steve, perhaps? Oh, you're on mute, Steve.
My apologies. No, I agree with what Robbie said there. I don't really have anything to add to that.
Okay. Sally, Nathan, Austin, any more thoughts?
The pre-assigning of the dishes, I think you can probably make that step where you're actually pre-assigning them a little bit quicker and less laborious in the lab. Whereas at the moment, obviously, you're pre-assigning egg collection dishes, pre-assigning stripping dishes. I think you could tweak the system so you and assign all the dishes at once just to that patient's name, but it'll just be a generic name. So it'll be, you know, Mrs. Smith's empty dish. And then obviously at the step where you're doing the collection is where you turn that one from empty dish to the egg collection dish.
Right.
You could do that, you know, all the way through the sperm and the egg, and whichever dishes you're going to use, you know, during that cycle.
Yeah, actually, that was something I was thinking about. How would you, if you've pre-assigned all your dishes, how do you get those witness steps? Because, you know, it normally wants a certain combination of things. But if you've, you know, you've got an empty dish, but then you've turned it into an egg collection dish, and you've got your egg collection dish and your, I don't know, prepared sperm, then you'll get that ability to do the insemination, the IVF. That would work.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. We have a question here. What stops one colleague from using another's key fob to attribute a triple witness to someone else? Steve, perhaps we come to you first with that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess the answer is probably that, well, there's two parts to the answer. One is that if somebody wants to do that maliciously, then I don't think anything that we're going to do is going to stop them. But the reality of the situation is that the key fobs are generally on lanyards or on pull-out elasticated things attached to the individual. So I'm struggling to see how you would actually steal somebody else's key fob to do that unless you were doing it maliciously.
Yeah, and I suppose, like you say, all systems are open to sabotage, aren't they? Sally, Nathan, Austin, in your... Sorry, Robbie, please go ahead.
Sorry, Emily. I think Sally raised an interesting when she mentioned about fingerprint scanning, and actually in response to that question, I mentioned this at a previous witness user group within the Fertility Partnership, that actually having fingerprint scanners rather than tags, fobs and PIN numbers for the users I would be looking at the fingerprint scanners more from an operator perspective than the patients, because nobody can steal your fingerprint. So you solve that problem by effectively just having the same as your mobile phone. You know, they need me to do a witness step for them, is my fingerprint is there, and that just removes that as an issue from the system. So certainly if you guys have the tech there to do that, I would be rolling that out for the operators and doing away with pins and fobs altogether.
But
if I might just add, the difficulty we have now is that embryologists are going to be wearing gloves far more of the time than they used to, and the logging in and the identification of an embryologist within the system happens quite a lot. So I'm not sure how well fingerprint recognition fits in with COVID.
That's a good point.
For the users, yeah. For the patients, yeah.
Same problem, maybe.
Yeah, same problem, yeah.
We need to just switch to retinal scanning next.
I think it's also worth noting that every step within the witness process is logged and recorded by the system. So if you did use somebody else's card and you were found using somebody else's card, then that would probably be some form of gross misconduct at work, and you shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I think we would all agree. Sally and Nathan, I don't know if your experience around the globe, you've encountered any strange situations like this.
The only thing I'd say is that from time to time we get asked about this. It's not completely infallible. You know, I've had people say, well, it doesn't stop me dropping a dish, does it? No. And it doesn't stop me, you know, I could still do the insemination. I just don't put a tag on the bottom of the dish or the tube. So yes, there is a certain amount, as Robbie said, deliberate, I think it's Robbie or Steve, deliberate sabotage. It can't stop that. If somebody's going to go down this maliciously, then they'll find a way to get around it.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have one more question, unless any more questions come in, and it's quite a big question. Do you think the HFEA or ARCS would have an appetite to review guidance around e-witnessing? And Steve, we'll come to you first with your experience with the HFEA and ARCS on that one.
Okay. Well, firstly, it would be wrong for me to second guess what the HFEA might do. other than to say that the guidance that ARCS and the BFS came up with in relation to clinics starting up again, that Robbie referred to in his presentation, that was drawn up together with the HFEA. They relied on the advice that came from the professional bodies, from ARCS and the BFS. I suppose I'm slightly happier to stick my neck out and certainly say that I would be prepared to take a proposal to ARCS and ask whether they might consider thinking about this with a view to perhaps taking some recommendations to the HFEA. You know, this is the best time we've ever had to do this, I think. So perhaps that is a way forward.
Robbie, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would echo exactly what Steve said there. You know, I think we need, I definitely think we need a coordinated response across the sector, and that done through engaging with organisations such as ARCS, etc., and working with the HFEA. You know, my experience with the HFEA was never that they were completely against our initial tweaking with their witness guidance. They were just very, very strict on, you know, you need to be aware of what the implications this were and have really detailed risk assessments on it. And I think a coordinated response would allow us to, you know, such has been done in the past with various things with ARCS, is to write up a draft framework for people to introduce a completely, you know, electronic witnessing system in the labs safely.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We don't have any more questions. Someone's put their hand up, and if you would like to ask a question, please do type it into the chat box. But other than that, I'll just go to the panel for some closing remarks. So, Robbie, anything else that you'd like to add to what you've already said today?
Oh, I'm running out of things to say now.
You've said a lot, and it's been fabulous. But
No, look, I mean, I'm just going to reiterate what I said is, like, embryologists, we at times can maybe be slightly resistant to change and get, particularly when it comes to things around risk, we are very risk averse people. Now, you know, when you look at the system that's there for our eyewitness, it can be modified and tweaked to a certain degree, I think, to really challenge the way we've done things conventionally for over 10 years. No one's really sat and said, actually, do we really need all these additional steps? And actually, I just think the current situation we find ourselves in creates the opportunity to ask those questions.
It is an opportunity, isn't it? And an opportunity to reassess and rethink. I think that's a good way to look at it. Steve, any closing comments from you?
I think it's been fascinating to hear how Robbie has done things slightly differently here, and within the context of approval from the HFEA. That's really, really interesting, I think. Embryologists are, they're resistant to change often, but they're actually very good at managing it. And I think we now have an opportunity to visit, as Robbie suggested, the whole of these pathways again, to see if they can't be more efficient, and just to say again, I'll very happily take this up with ARCS and see if we can't develop some sort of coordinated response across the sector here.
Great, thank you. And Austin, Sally and Nathan, anything further that you'd like to input this evening?
I'd just like to add, if anyone is thinking of tweaking their diagram, just to get in touch with your account manager, and they'll get you in touch with myself or my colleague Grant, and we'll help you make the changes.
Thank you, Nathan. We appreciate that support.
Yeah, and I'll be spending the evening playing with my system just to see if I can replicate what Robbie's doing and see if I can break it.
We're always learning, aren't we, and evolving the system ourselves. Yeah. Austin, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that we obviously have some existing users on the webinar, and if they are interested in looking at options for increasing social distancing, then to get in touch, and we can discuss some different options and different ways of using the system.
Super. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody this evening. Thank you so much to Robbie for giving up his time and putting a lot of work as well into preparing that presentation. I think it's been very thought-provoking and stimulating, and I should imagine we're going to get quite a few queries now from people looking to update their witness point diagram and looking to evolve their use of the system. And thank you very much to Steve for the introduction and for joining us and being on the panel for questions. And also thank you to Austin, Sally and Nathan for being on the panel as well and answering questions. And of course, thank you to everybody at home and in the lab or wherever you're working from these days for joining us this evening. We hugely appreciate your company. Thank you very much. Have a nice rest of your evening. Goodbye.